So, what was John like as a kid? What did John aspire to be? What did John look up?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a deep question or questions. I guess I've always been sort of into technology. I was telling somebody this the other day that I don't remember the exact year, but probably in 1982 or 1983. And as I say that, I'm definitely dating myself. But back then, I don't know why, but I bought a Commodore VIC 20. And if you don't know what that is, you'll have to search the internet. But it was something I hooked up to the TV and had a cassette player was my call it storage, and I would program little basic programs like Pong or asteroids or who knows what anymore. But yeah, as I think about that, I mean that was 45 years ago almost, and that's kind of a crazy thing to think about. But the tech just kind of stayed in me. I mean, in the early 90s, I was an early kind of Windows PC guy and used Microsoft Office. And I actually, in the early 90s, opened a retail computer store. I don't know what else to call it. And started doing application training for companies where I was. So, teaching things like Windows or Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel and stuff like that. We actually built computers. Back then, anybody could build a computer. You could buy all the parts and build those. And then it just kind of progressed from there. I mean, my real first, what I call career job was I was recruited by Microsoft back in 96 and wound up spending 7 great years there. Got to do a lot of different stuff. They moved me kind of all over the country. I lived in Seattle and Atlanta, Minneapolis. And then after 7 years there, I wound up going to Dell. Actually, the last year at Microsoft is when I got into government. I started selling to government back in 2003, and that's been sort of almost everything I've done for the last 23 years. I guess it's been is just getting into government. So I went from Microsoft and Dell managing large government accounts up in the upper Midwest. And then when I left Dell, I wound up going to GovTech SaaS companies, specifically in public safety and then in justice. So yeah, I mean, I've been sort of in it forever. Um, I know one of the things you asked was sort of what shaped me. And I think that is, I'm 57. So there, I dated myself. And in 57 years, man, a lot has shaped me. In the last 25 years or whatever, I've been married to my wonderful and what I tend to call very patient wife, Renee, for almost 22 years. It'll be this year. We've got a couple of adult children now, a ton of animals, dogs, cats, cattle, if you can believe it, horses, and stuff like that. And so that shapes me sort of day to day. And I'll warn you now, this might be something you want to cut, quite honestly, but I think I tend to like to tell a little bit more of my backstory because I hope at the end of the day it might be encouraging to someone, I guess. So I was one of those kids. I grew up in foster care, left home when I was 17, had no idea what I was going to do. Didn't know my mom, didn't know my dad until I was in my early 30s. Didn't do very good in high school, didn't go to college. Um, and what I tell people is I learned from the school of hard knocks, and that's probably something that people say in the U.S. more than anywhere. But um, at the end of the day, life took all sorts of twists and turns as I made it to where I am, and I'm sure there's going to be a ton more of twists and turns even after today. And I guess what I try and tell people all the time, especially sort of the younger generation, is that's okay. There is no perfect path, right? Don't hold on too tightly to what somebody else tells you is the definition of success, right? Find your own. Be super willing to take chances. Say yes to things it doesn't feel safe, or I don't know. It's one of those things. I'm sure it's happening globally, but we've sort of made our kids afraid to take chances and do stuff that doesn't seem right or somebody might criticize as being a bad decision or whatever. And I would just say I'm proof that anything can happen because 20, 30 years ago, had somebody said I would live on a ranch in Texas and be raising longhorn cattle, never in a million years would I've thought that was coming. But life throws you all kinds of interesting stuff. And I think it's important that people just say, I'm going to try it. Just take a chance. Say yes.
Yeah, I think this is something that is this is the exact goal of this platform, of this podcast. The thing is that the concept of entrepreneurship is sold to be very dreamy, where it is something that where you just launch a product, when you make money, and then that's the end of it. The concept of being an entrepreneur is that you have to have a really high pain threshold. The pain tolerance should be really, really high. And I think to some extent, whether it's a boon or it's something, you wouldn't call it a curse, but in some ways, some people do have a really high pain tolerance during their childhood, and it helps them when you put them amongst other peers. As you said, based on your childhood, I think whenever you see a lot of twists and turns and you start dealing with it, I think you're not more risk averse, but your pain tolerance is really high. So even a lot amount of pain where others crack, most of the entrepreneurs do not crack. And I think that's a very unique skill set that entrepreneurs in general need to develop. Because it's a hard business to be in. It's not a fancy one that you every day you take risk, every day you're responsible for it. Wonderful, wonderful things that you said. I want to talk about why tech. Why not something else? Why tech? And then why is it something that it was something influenced in your house? Something that you saw? Why tech? Because people do different things, but why specifically tech?
You know what? I can't tell you why. I mean, why, when I was 14 years old, did I decide I wanted to buy a computer with the money I made on my newspaper route? I couldn't even begin to tell you. I mean, because that would have been, in 82, 83, that was a bizarre thing to even consider, right? I don't know. I wish I had a better story for that, but I just have no idea. It happened. And I think it was just something that it was fun and interesting and a challenge. And yeah, no, I don't know.
The reason I'm asking this is because it's even if there is some skill set that has existed for a long period of time, it's difficult to find somebody to learn from, because back then I don't think the internet or any of
Oh,
these
yeah.
AI did not exist. So you could not learn it from somebody. So you picked
Yeah.
something that was very new to everybody, but you were able to get into it. So I want to understand, like, how did you learn it, or how did you go about? Why did you find it fascinating?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was new, where to learn it. I mean, back then it was magazines. I mean, they would give you examples of how to write Pong using basic code, right? And for those people that have never seen basic, that is line 10 this, line 20 that, line 30 this. I mean, it was just super basic programming language. And it was a challenge. I think I knew nobody else was doing it. And it was just really unique. And I just was born. I use a term that nobody uses anymore. I was born a bithead. It's just, yeah, it was just kind of, it somehow was just sort of part of me from the beginning somehow.
Okay. Why sales? Why not just stay in technology?
Yeah, good question. I think it's a combination of things. I think part of it is personality, right? You enjoy relationships with people, you enjoy talking. That's a good thing in sales typically. But I think at the same time, I think you have to be risk tolerant, because you have to put yourself out there, and be willing to, take a bunch of no's, or, get criticized, or any number of things, right? All the reasons people don't join sales, or at least last in it, it's all the reasons that sort of go along with kind of what I was saying earlier and what you mentioned, right? Is this ability or willingness to take risks and take a punch in the gut or anything like that. I think it just naturally kind of goes with that.
Okay. And in terms of sales, like, how old were you when you started sales? How many years in tech, and when did the first sales experience start? When were you facing the customer?
Yeah, so it's kind of crazy. I mean, as I look back at this, so I said in 96, I wound up going to Microsoft. My first job was an absolute bithead. I joined as an enterprise network protocols support engineer. So total geek. Back in 96, TCP IP was, I mean, network protocols, yeah, they existed, but surely not a lot of people understood them. It was definitely more of an enterprise thing, Boeing, or, big companies that were really into sort of understanding networking and using it to its capacity. Um, it's kind of here's a trivia thing. Most people have never knew there was other network protocols out there beyond TCP/IP back in the late 90s. One was called IPX. Most people have never heard of it. It's from an old network operating system called NetWare that ceased to exist many, many years ago. And Microsoft even had their own called NetBEUI. And again, they don't exist because TCP/IP became the standard. But yeah, I mean, those are the days that I lived in, that I, had to even know how to troubleshoot IPX or NetBEUI or crazy things like that. But I was in the same building as the sales team for, at the time, the Pacific Northwest. And I met the manager of the sales engineer team. So these are the pre-sales engineers for the Pacific Northwest. And I just loved what he told me they did. And so I joined his team, and I was a sales engineer probably 5 of the 7 years, that I was at Microsoft, and absolutely loved it. And then the last year, I finally decided, hey, why don't I take the next step and actually become an account executive, somebody that's managing the accounts as opposed to sort of being the team, part of the overlay team of that salesperson.
How big was Microsoft when this happened?
I want to say maybe 50,000. It's hard. I don't remember, to be honest with you. I know when we did on the sales side, we did what we called the Microsoft Global Summit, which was where they brought all of the salespeople, all of the overlay people within sales. And there was about 4,000 to 5,000 of us then. But it was a different time, right? I mean, it's kind of fun to show people pictures of me and Steve Ballmer having a beer together, right? Or hanging out with Bill Gates. Because, the late 90s, it was just a different kind of place. None of that would ever happen today, which is unfortunate, because it was definitely a lot more fun back then.
Got it. And were they doing any kind of government contracts back then, or was it just completely purely commercial?
Oh no, I mean, like I said, my last job at Microsoft in 2003 was selling to government. And so what my responsibilities back then it was mostly just licensing, selling enterprise agreements to, for me, was the state of Minnesota and the state of North Dakota. That was kind of my job. Microsoft still doesn't, I don't think, but Microsoft had a very small consulting services group. And so there wasn't a lot of, the people, we weren't doing consulting. But even today, and since forever, I mean, Microsoft's very partner driven. And so I worked a lot with partners, whether those were resellers selling licenses, like some of the large resellers like Software House International or CDW or companies like that, or how I got to Dell was I worked very closely with my counterpart at Dell, right? Because Dell was a big Microsoft supporting company. And so I spent a lot of time, working with those folks too. So yeah, that's all we did was sell to government. Again, it was a different thing. It wasn't selling solutions per se, although that was my first job my first project in North Dakota was the SAP rollout on Oracle for the state of North Dakota. So even back then, yeah, we did big projects like that. I mean, on statewide levels. So,
what was your learning about GovTech back then? Because what was the market like? Was it even an established market? Was GovTech even a thing? Was it a coined term during that period, or was it just like they're doing contracts for government?
Yeah, no, GovTech was definitely not a term back then. I mean, SaaS wasn't a term, right? I mean, back then you had ASP, right? Which is the old application services model or application services programming, but there was no SaaS. There were web applications per se, but there was no such thing as SaaS because there was no cloud. There was nothing like that. And so there wasn't necessarily a lot of companies building software specifically for government. Government was just another type of client like any other B2B. Some things were, specific to government, especially at the federal level, but there definitely was no vertical necessarily called GovTech back then.
Just if you were to draw, let's say, a parallel in terms of what it was in terms of selling it to, let's say, a consumer or another company like Dell, and then what it was to sell to the government in terms of maybe a timeline or in terms of compliance? What was the biggest challenges that you kind of had on both of them?
Yeah, and I think this goes to selling to government across the board, right? And yeah, everything takes longer. At the end of the day, everything just takes a lot longer. There's more hurdles to jump through for procurement, contract negotiation, and legal become more complex. There's a ton of personas that are involved. And when I say that, I mean, I'll give you an example. For 8 years, I sold to prosecutors. So not just GovTech, but attorneys and elected prosecutors. And what people, it just doesn't happen in B2B. In B2B, there is typically some decision maker. Maybe it's the CEO, maybe it's the CIO. Somebody is going to at some point say, yes, we're doing this. And that's not really the way it works in government. There tend to be large buying committees that all have a say. An elected official might have more weight in what they say, but I see this all the time where there's what somebody might call lowly position, and they sort of ignore that person, or they don't think of them as being important enough to even, bother with. And they are the ones that'll sink the deal. I use this as an example all the time. If I take a prosecutor's office, there's an elected prosecutor who's an attorney. There's all sorts of managing attorneys under that elected prosecutor that manage different types of cases. I mean, they've got civil and criminal and all kinds of stuff. Then there are all the attorneys that work for those managing attorneys. But then you've got investigators, you've got paralegals, you've got legal assistants, you've got people that are called victim advocates, you've got IT, you've got procurement. I mean, suddenly the list is really, really long, right? And a really good example of where I was successful that I think other companies were not is I mentioned the one person, or a team potentially, called victim advocates. And if you don't know what a victim advocate is, it's somebody that if you were a victim of a crime in the prosecutor's office, there is someone that will help you understand what the process is going to be like, help you get to court when you need to, prepare you as a witness, all those kinds of things. And people would say they have nothing to do with making the decision. And the fact is they absolutely do. And part of that reason is the prosecutor's office winds up getting grant money to fill that position because it has really complex reporting requirements back to the federal government to say, how many people are you serving? What is the racial makeup of them? What kind of crimes are they victims of? What was the relationship between the victim and the defendant? And so that person can say, no, your software doesn't do what I need it. And that's it. You're done. Everybody else could be convinced. And that one person, what some would call lowly or just not important, can sink the entire deal. And so I think that's one of the things you got to be careful with in government, selling to government. And the same goes for legal tech. I mean, that's another vertical that I work in. There's a lot of people involved, and they all tend to have some amount of weight that they can pull in making the decision. It's really interesting. One of the things I've really worked on that kind of goes with that whole persona model is something I call WIFM. Some people have heard the acronym. It simply means what's in it for me, right? And at the end of the day, we're all humans, and humans tend to care more about themselves than somebody else. I mean, it's just human nature. And when it comes to all those personas, they're all going to have a different reason why your solution matters, right? And so if I'm selling case management software to a prosecutor, the elected prosecutor, he wants to get reelected. He doesn't want to be in the news, and he wants to be able to tell the county, I make the county safer, right? You've got an IT person that couldn't care any less about what that elected prosecutor cares about, right? They care about uptime and disaster recovery and compliance with regulations. And then you've got the victim advocate. They care if they can get their reporting done. And what I see too often is people will send the same generic message to all of them. This is my solution, and this is what it does. And pretty soon, everybody tunes you out because you're not speaking to any of them and why they would even care about your solution, right? It's a pretty interesting thing that I think again in government sales, it's just more complex and it's easy to miss these what some might call little things that are just different from B2B.
Let's take this example as case management itself, right? And then let's maybe understand, like, I understand the part of where you need to have a stable infrastructure and you need to have disaster recovery and stuff like that. But how does one go about and then identify the requirement that government needs? Like, for example, if you have to build a SaaS product today, and then you find somebody as a design partner, any company, and then you kind of work with them on a feedback loop, and then you iterate the product, and then you'll be able to push out different versions. And this can happen over a week, over a month, and then it depends on how many iterations it goes and how complex the product is. But when you're building for the government, it is at scale. So it's not that one small portion of the government is going to be using it. It's going to be across the board. So how does one go about, like, for even the case management itself? How does one go about understanding what do they need? How do you build something that they need? How does one go about that?
I think it goes back to understanding all of the people that are involved. Interestingly enough, the company I had worked for was sold earlier this year. And so I got a lot of calls from those companies that were looking at buying it. And it was one of the questions that came up almost every single time was, who in the prosecutor's office uses this software? And I was like, you clearly don't understand. Every single person in that office uses the software. So you need to be in tune with everybody. You have to take the time. If there are 15 different personas in the office, you need to spend time with every single one of them to understand their unique requirements because they're all going to have some different part of the software that they're going to touch. So a victim advocate is going to work in their victim advocate module. They're not going to get involved in charging a case or whatever an office manager does, or maybe a legal assistant. And so you have to invest the time to understand all the different people that are going to be using it and what they're going to do with it.
But I understand in terms of if you're already established. Let's say for somebody, for example, wants to start up today, and they've never been into GovTech, and they're looking to get into GovTech. So how do they know the customer's problem? How do they go about to find out there is something that a small niche or some problem that they can solve?
Yeah, I think you still have to do, I mean, at some point, you're going to have some amount of time that you have to spend with the agency that you decide you're going to serve. And I'll tell you, one of the things I've run into most often is GovTech SaaS companies are started by people that used to work in the agency that they now are going to serve, right? So or they've been personally touched somehow, right? The company I worked for that sold to prosecutors, the owner of the company, his sister had been killed in an auto accident by a drunk driver. So he became personally involved in the justice system. And he saw where there were problems, where there were things that didn't work right. And so he made a commitment. I'm going to find a way to better the justice system. I've got a client that sells software used by probation offices, right? So if you're a defendant and you get in trouble, you go to court, the court says, okay, we're not going to put you in jail, but you have to be good for 6 months. And for that 6 months, you've got to check in with what's called a probation officer and prove you have a job, you have a stable place you're living, etc. That founder knew that problem because he was involved in that whole system. And so it's really hard, I would say, if you haven't been personally sort of involved within the agency that you're now going to go serve, whether that be maybe you worked in that agency, maybe you were involved as a client of that agency, it's really hard to understand why that, whatever solution you're going to develop, it's hard to understand why that makes an impact for that agency. Now, some of them are generic. Document management, right? Document management is similar across all sorts of industries out there, right? I mean, document management is document management to some degree. But when you get into some of these specialty things like prosecutor case management or electronic subpoena of law enforcement, right? They become very specialty. And so you really need to have some sort of connection typically to whatever solution you're trying to develop.
Let's say, for example, how many players are there in the market? So, let's say, for example, AI, we have 4 or 5 companies right now that's currently doing AI. They're doing general AI, but in terms of they do have some specificity in terms of either they're good at coding or they're good at image generation and stuff like that. But in terms of government, the GovTech sector, how many players are there in general? Because as you said, I think understanding that if at all there is any kind of problem statement, you have to be a part of the government or you have to be some way involved with the judicial system. So which basically has a really high threshold for the rest of nobody can get in without having any of these prior experiences. So how many players are there and how many people usually come in? And if so, what is the timeline of that happen?
Yeah, no, that it's really interesting, and again, it's one of these things nobody even realizes. There are, I think, I've put together a list of 98 subverticals within GovTech, and what I mean by that is there is finance, there is what's called 311 or citizen request management, there is public safety, there's CAD, there's records management, there is video management for law enforcement, there is public utilities. I mean, the list goes on and on when you start breaking it down. Now, within each of those, there might only be 10 ERP vendors for government. There might only be 5 or 10 for law enforcement's video management. But it's when you combine all of the little subverticals within there, because any GovTech company really, to some degree, really needs to sort of have a good niche that they can say, we are experts in this thing. It's hard for a company to be the best, I don't know, call it CRM, which is not customer relationship management in government. It's citizen request management, right? It's hard to be the best citizen request management solution, but at the same time, be the best computer-aided dispatch for law enforcement. Now, there are companies, don't get me wrong, there are companies that try and spread across every single subvertical, and I would contend none of them are the best at any of them. They're maybe good at all of them, but I always encourage companies, be the best you can at that whatever niche you choose, whether that's, again, citizen request management or computer-aided dispatch or public utilities billing or any number of things, finance, whatever. So suddenly, yeah, there are thousands. There are a couple thousand GovTech software companies when you break them down to all of those subverticals.
So how big could, if you were to put it in terms of the market cap, in terms of like let's say a TAM Samsung, how big is the market? Let's say for example IT, we have let's say 200 to 300 billion. So what would that money be in terms of GovTech, specifically not in terms of government contract, but in terms of GovTech?
It's huge. It's huge. I think that's the part that nobody understands, right? I mean, when you start to take in SLED, which is state and local and education, and then you add federal on top of that, you're talking tens of billions of dollars. I mean, the government buys a lot of software, right? Government contracts tend to be really, really big. I think that's one of the other things that often, as a SaaS company, people get nervous about, I would say, especially when it comes to GTM. So again, your TAM is, if I'm a CRM SaaS provider, my TAM is much smaller, right? There's a limited number of cities in the United States, and there aren't going to be any new cities. It's not like new businesses. Thousands of new businesses start every year. You're not going to see a new city pop up out of nowhere, right? So your TAM becomes small. And SaaS companies tend to be pretty good at their average contract value, right? Their ACV. They know what their lifetime value is. They know what their churn rate is, which helps them figure out their lifetime value. And they know their CAC, their customer acquisition cost, right? It is such a different world for government. So ACV tends to be higher than B2B. right? LTV is really high because the average churn rate for government customers is 8 to 10 years. So, because they only get a single budget every single year and it's got to go through all of this procurement process and funding, and they don't change software very often. I know companies that have been using the same, or government agencies using the same software for 20 years. So when it comes to go to market, it's different too because the calculation becomes very different, right? My CAC can be much higher for my customer acquisition cost because my LTV is huge compared to B2B, right? So it's a completely different sort of way to calculate it because it is just, again, but it's at the same time it's much more complex, right? My longest sales cycle was 5 years. Yeah, nobody believes that.
What was this for again? What is the
It
product?
was for that prosecutor case management. I was selling it to Clark County, Nevada, which is Las Vegas. And it's not the only one that's been years long. But the problem is you go back to that, what I said earlier, government agencies get one single budget once a year. And that's it. They can't go back and say, hey, I need a little more budget for this, or I need a little more budget for that, because revenue in a government agency is based on taxes. And so I can't, in the middle of the year, go back and tell citizens, hey, we're going to tax you a little bit more because we got to buy this software. It's never going to happen, right? And so if you're selling something to government and they say, yeah, we want it, and they go to budget negotiations and it doesn't get approved, guess what? It's a whole nother year before they get to go back and ask for it again. And if it doesn't get approved that year, it's a whole nother year until they can ask for it again. So you definitely have to be in it for the long haul, because it literally could be years. Even if they want it, no matter how bad they want it, it could be years before they actually get the budget approved for it.
What do they do what do companies do in that period of 1 year? Let us say they don't get approved. It's not like they can go to another customer. So what do they do in that 1 year period?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that nobody, again, that's kind of the hidden problem. I go to some government agency, I convince them my software is exactly what you want, and they say, yep, we want it. They go to get budget, they don't get it. And you might say, oh, well, we'll just wait until next year and they'll try again and hopefully they'll get it approved. But guess what? That entire year between budget cycles, your competitors are back in there knowing that you didn't get the sale done and they're trying to sell against you. So the entire time you thought you had it wrapped up until they didn't get the budget. Now you've got to compete for a whole nother year again, making sure that your competitor doesn't wedge in and convince them otherwise, because then they'll ask for budget for your competitor. So it's not like you get to take a break once you've convinced them. You can't take a break until you've got a signed contract, which could, again, take years to get.
But product development keeps on going, is it? Sales does its job, and what about product development? Does it keep iterating on how can we make it better during the period?
Yeah, it always has to. Absolutely. Some of it is driven by competitors, right? I have to keep in front of my competitors, but often too in government, it's based on laws or, regulations that are passed that my software might have to meet, right? And so I'm constantly having to innovate to stay competitive, but I also have to continue innovating to keep up with any new, laws or anything that might be passed. I mean, when it comes to AI, a really good example is in California a few years ago. They passed legislation in California that was geared towards something called race blind charging. And so that's not going to make any sense to anybody. So I'll try and make it a simple thing. But the concept was that a prosecutor could make a determination about charging someone for a crime based on their race, right? So they were being racially profiling someone. And so the state of California said, okay, when it comes now to charging someone, the attorney that's reviewing that, anything within the reports from the police department or anything has to redact any words, any phrases, anything that would be indicative of the race of the person being charged, right? I don't know. If the defendant really was black, I couldn't mention maybe curly hair. If they were Hispanic, I couldn't mention the word, it's called quinceañera, which is a party that Hispanic families have. So, because as soon as I say that, I've given some indication now that the defendant is some specific race. So now those case management software providers, they had to build that into their software, not because of a competitive reason, but because the state now required that to be a part of the software. So those companies are innovating not just for competitive reasons, but even pressure from the states to say this must be a part of your software. And that's where it gets into all of the compliance and regulations that GovTech has to deal with. I mean, there's all kinds of things when it comes to, there's something called CJIS, or the Criminal Justice Information System. There's FedRAMP. There's all sorts of regulations specific to selling to the government that you've just got to be prepared to deal with.
So how long does this take? Usually, when you get, maybe there's a new law that is passed, and then you get a requirement that this is what you need to do. How long does it take to develop it? How long to test it? And then how long to train them on how to use it?
Yeah, it really depends on how big the legislation change is. So, like that one for the race blind charging, they gave them 3 years to be able to do that because it was so advanced. Imagine AI had to be able to read documents and identify the words or phrases that would be indicative of someone's race. And that was a really complex problem that they had to, figure out. And so they had Stanford working on it and Harvard working on it, just trying to figure out how do we do this. And then once they got there, the software vendors had to figure out how to now build that in to the software. So some of it's, you've got years to do it. Some of it might be 6 or 9 months. I mean, legislation or laws are passed typically every single year. And so there might be something that makes it something they have to do really quickly. So yeah, that can definitely be a challenge.
There is something that's a switching cost that kind of has for any product that any consumer uses. Like the switching cost is basically, when I'm using this product, unless and until I am dissatisfied with the product, or if there's another product that is maybe offering something better, or if I'm getting a reasonable price difference. So these are the major reasons why they switch. But in terms of government, if they have to switch, it is the scale at which everybody has to switch to the new system, and everybody has to be trained on the new system. Even if it's a small UI change, even if you move a small element on your system, everybody needs to be trained, and there's a huge process doing it. So how does switching happen? Why would they even need to switch for a product? Usually companies will end up doing whatever they ask them to do, but when does the switch really happen?
Yeah, it's difficult for government to switch. And that's why the churn rate is 8, 10, 12, 20 years, is because not only is it the challenge of doing a forklift and saying, we're getting rid of this one, we're bringing this new one in. I mean, that is complex all on its own, right? And that applies to government or business or whatever. Nobody likes all that change to happen. But it's much more difficult for government to go back to whoever their budget authority is, whether that's their city council or their county commissioners or somebody at the state, and say, I don't really like this, so we want to get new software. Here, go back to that idea that cities or counties or states and the feds, their revenue is based on taxes. And if you think about it, so I live in a small city, everybody lives in some city that is charging them taxes, right? So I pay taxes. And let's say next year, I don't know, my little town of Taylor, they decided they wanted to buy some new software for the police department, let's say. And so they're going to have to find revenue for it. And maybe they put an initiative on the ballot to say, hey, we want to raise taxes a penny. It's only going to mean $20 a month or $20 a year or whatever to you as a homeowner. Guess what? How many times do you think that passes? Even if it's just the smallest amount, it's rare. No citizen wants to pay more taxes. And so budgets don't get to expand in government just because. I can't sell more widgets as a government agency to make more revenue. I get the revenue that my tax base generates, and that's sort of it. Now, there are grants out there that are available, but they're not all over the place, and they're only applicable to some, specific use cases. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's not something they do. And with that, an interesting tactic that many GovTech vendors I've competed with will do is they will build the cost of one product into the other and give it to that agency for free. I'll give you an example. I used to compete against a company that sold court software, and I did the prosecutor. Now, they're semi related, of course, but the prosecutor wanted their own case management software because it was unique in the way that they did their business, right? This competitor would sell the court software and tell the county, hey, we'll just give you the prosecutor software. Sounds like a good deal, right? So the county, the budget authority says, yeah, why wouldn't we do that? And so now the prosecutor has new case management software. They never wanted it. They don't like it. But guess what? They have to use it because they're going to go back to the budget authority and say, hey, this is not even what we wanted. We want to get our own. And the budget authority is going to say, we bought you something already. Figure out how to use it. And so again, like you were saying, it's not that easy for a rip and replace at a government agency because they just don't have the budget for it. They don't have sort of the willpower to say this is so bad, I'm going to go try and get budget for it, or the inverse. I've got budget and I'm going to not fund this thing so that I can fund this other thing because again, they've got a limited budget every single year.
Yeah, but I think even if they did have a budget, let's say within whatever the budget that was there, but even then, I think switching cost still is high because in terms of training, because my perspective more in terms of if you do it in a SaaS company, most of it they're working on a certain technology, and whenever you change, let's say for example, you change the API key, use a different AI model, all you have to do is just switch an API key, right? Or if you are doing something, let's say you're changing printers, then it's not going to be that big of a switch or that big to train. But here you have people who are working in different ranking at different levels in the same system. It's like how a hospital works, where the nurse, the doctor, everybody uses the same system. So it's going to be very difficult for them to even switch it. So basically, what happens to the other competitors during this period? Because I'm assuming the contracts are really, really long period of time. That maybe it's like 5 to 10 years of contract that each company kind of signs with the government. And do these companies fall out?
You just know, yeah, you just know that there are agencies that have long-term contracts, and you just know that getting them to switch, even if they had budget, getting them to be willing to try and make a change, it's really difficult. Yeah. And that it's again, so you take that into consideration how long it is before they churn, and then you sort of take into account how hard it is to sell to them in the procurement process and the legal part of it. And suddenly, you know, and then you take into account there's no growth, there's no market growth. Cities and counties, state aid, they're not growing, right? There's a limited number in your TAM. When you start putting that all together, greenfield becomes really small. There's not new greenfield all the time, because when I was selling to counties, there's 3,000 counties in the United States, and there's never going to be more. And if you've got 50% of the market and somebody else has 10%, it's a shuffling game more than it is anything. It's not, hey, there's these other 6 counties that we've never heard of, let's go see if we can sell them something, right? Somebody's been there already.
But I think the reason why I kind of wanted to ask the setup was because right now, I don't think most of the new technology or new companies couldn't give maybe that big of a margin in terms of competence or in terms of features. But right now, we have AI. And I think this can give a competitive edge towards for any kind of products, or maybe increase the time, maybe decrease the time, and then increase the efficiency for all of the people. But the thing here is that there is not that much of reliance in terms of the outcome or the responsibility of who takes the decision. Let's say, for example, AI says that this is the document that it is drafted, and there is no vetting that can be done. And for each one of the government agencies, organizations, or people under it, I think accuracy, even though the system is old, even though they don't need new features, I think they're more reliant in terms of, I just want the system to do this. I don't want the AI to maybe increase it, and then I don't want to be inaccurate, right? Or incorrect in terms of whatever is being the outputted as an artifact. So, will AI disrupt the government sector, GovTech sector?
Yeah, I mean it's actually a big deal right now. So historically, government agencies have never had a fully staffed agency. They never have enough employees. Not everybody wants to work for a government agency. So people tend to do, the jobs of two different people at the same time. So AI has become critical now for GovTech, right? Because now software can help them do a better job serving their citizens that they maybe not have been able to do in the past. So if I'm a city and a citizen calls and says there's a pothole in my street, you call, in the US it's 311, you call 311, the non-emergency, and say, "Hey, there's a pothole in the middle of my street." Somebody answers that phone, takes a message, who knows where it goes, right? Because that person is busy doing 100 other things. And so a lot of that gets lost. And so a lot of the GovTech companies are now finding ways to effectively supplement what humans can't get to, right? So whether that's taking help, call it help desk tickets from citizens, if you want to think of it that way, right? Or answering questions. A lot of web bots are being deployed now. So when a citizen has a question about how does this thing work or who should I contact, I don't have to have a person answering the phone now, right? Because that person, there are more, call it valuable things they could be taking care of than the day-to-day, basic questions that they get 100 times a week. So there's a lot of application in AI right now in probably every subvertical on how, because at the end of the day, the cities have to answer to their citizens.
Now, I think you established how tough the market is. Now, what is John's go-to-market strategy for this tough market?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's kind of this, I kind of walk clients through sort of from top to bottom in some degrees, right? It's defining the ICP, and too often I have people that say I sell to law enforcement. That's a little generic, right? And so it's hard to become the expert in that, whatever segment that you're wanting to be. So I tend to say, hey, pick the size of the agency. So cities between 25,000 and 100,000, maybe in these 6 states, instead of trying to spread yourself across all states. Because one of the unique things that happens in government too is referrals matter much more from somebody within the state that I am in than somebody in another state. Sounds like a weird thing, but if I am selling to someone, I don't know, I'm selling law enforcement software to somebody in Arizona, and they say, well, who else like me uses your software? And you say, oh, I've got this customer in Virginia. And they're like, that's great, but who else in Arizona uses it, right? And so when I try and get my clients to think, okay, let's pick some small number of states and get a beachhead there, right? Find an agency, get 2 agencies, even if it's through a pilot or something, because somebody within a state vetting your software is 10 times more powerful than somebody from a different state. And it's not that the software doesn't work the same, but within my state, I know the laws are the same. I know the regulations are the same. I know business is done similarly. And you've already tested it. Okay, that goes a long way, right? And so niching down to a population size, a number of states, whatever it is that makes sense, and then getting in there and kind of what I talked about earlier, defining all the different personas that are going to be involved, coming up with their WIFM. So when you start your outbound, whether that's LinkedIn, email, phone calls, whatever makes sense for your agency type, you can speak to them about the things that are important to them, right? And so it's just kind of walking through all of that to make sure that you're thinking about all the little things. And if there is compliance measures, if your product requires CGIS compliance, get ahead of that. Don't wait until you're trying to
Can you give me
sell
an
it.
example of what a compliance is? Like, for example, in IT and tech, what we do is we call it SOC 2 Type 2. So that is a required compliance to get into most of the enterprise businesses. Is there a certification or something like that, like HIPAA or anything like that for government that you kind of
For
need?
government?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it depends on that subvertical. So a common one is in public safety and justice. There's something called CJIS compliance. So it stands for Criminal Justice Information Systems. And it is incredibly tight on security, right? You're talking about the criminal justice records or the records that somebody was arrested for X, Y, or Z. So it's very sensitive data that's actually controlled by the FBI. And so if you're going to be accessing or dealing with data that falls into that criminal justice information system, you have to get CJIS compliant and certified. You have to be certified that everything that you have to do between security and things like that, that you've met all those requirements. And every year you have to prove that you are continuing to stay CJIS compliant, right? There are other ones. There's all kinds of compliances depending on the vertical that you're selling into. And you have to be familiar with those. Just like if you're selling into healthcare, you need to be familiar with HIPAA and what the requirements are.
What does it mean when a government says they are a supply chain risk? Because they just told Anthropic is a supply chain risk. What does it mean? Are they flagging the government or banning them to do any business with the government? What does it mean when a government says they're a supply chain risk?
Yeah, I mean that often that is an indication that whatever compliance they were supposed to have, they have failed that somewhere. So if I'm, and I just keep talking about CJIS, if I am dealing with criminal justice records and I had a data leak or a data breach, yeah, I mean you're sunk. It's hard to recover from that, right? Because now you've shown that you can't keep that kind of data secure. It's like, interestingly enough, some people know that Azure and AWS have Gov data centers, and the security is insane on them. They require not just things like biometrics, they have armed guards that patrol the data centers. They have multiple layers of biometric security. They've got, 3 levels higher than sort of normal data centers, because you're talking about storing sensitive government information. And then you get to Fed and the federal, having federal data. I mean, that's incredibly complex when you're talking about being, selling to the Department of Defense or, things like that. So yeah, you don't want to do something wrong and get flagged as somebody that blew it.
I think this is the question I kind of asked in the beginning, because I wanted to ask in terms of, like, whenever you want to start something in GovTech, you cannot directly go ahead and start something. You need to know something about, maybe somebody at least in the system who can explain to you in terms of what it takes to be in the part of the system, where you participate. I think I saw something that you said you can save about 18 months of time, because you'll find out all of these during those 18 months. What are the blockers, where you hit them? I think that is where you kind of come in terms of, because you have the market experience with them. What is one thing that you will tell them today in the age of 20, it's in the age of AI? What is one thing that you will tell GovTech companies what the future might look like?
I keep going back to it. You have to understand all of the people involved and what matters to them. It doesn't, if you can't answer that question, you can't learn it on the fly, because you'll wind up in a sales situation where this happens all the time. The person you didn't know about suddenly walks in and says, "Hey, wait, no, this doesn't work for me." And that's it. You're done. It's over. And you can't go back and suddenly create the part of the software that you were missing for that person. So you really need to have a really good handle on all of the people that are going to use your software and what their unique requirements are going to be, to make sure, everybody, because again, like you said previously, it's not just one small part of government. You're talking about an entire agency and how they might all touch that same software. Even if they're not in that department, there's the potential for them to have something to do with it.
Yep. John, thanks a lot, John. I think this kind of covers, I think most of the audience probably will never not even know what GovTech is. I think this will kind of break down to them what it means and I think this industry and market is not only new, but you need to have a lot of patience and a lot of knowledge about what this industry is. I think that is something that
Great.
I've kind of learned. But again, thanks a lot for your time. And
I tell people all the time, you have to have a strong stomach.
yeah, exactly. High pain tolerance or strong stomach.
Yeah,
Because
high
when
pain
you said,
tolerance.
because when you were saying in terms of that you have to wait for 5 years, even for that contract, I think it gives a lot of perspective to people coming
Yeah.
in. But yeah, thanks a lot, John.